Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. And before we get started, I would like to talk with you this morning about the principles that are foundational to Seattle Atheist Church. So we have three, and I want to clarify them. We have some new people here today. So the first one is that at Seattle Atheist Church, we attempt to make truth claims. And we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. The second principle is that we try to be excellent to other conscious beings. And the last one is that we believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. And so those three principles are sort of the organizing principles behind the different talks and things that we do. A while ago, we gave a talk on aid in Africa. And so today we're going to have another talk about aid in Africa. And following the first idea that we attempt to make truth claims, but we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. So we never tell people what to think here at Seattle Atheist Church. But together we are committed to trying to figure out how to think so that we can do it better. So other churches might have a goal of helping you deepen your faith. We have a goal of helping you develop your capacity for reason. Okay, and so there's a woman named Linda Elder, who her website is criticalthinking.org, and there she actually has steps to kind of like how to be a better thinker. One of the things that is important to do is to seek out different opinions or different points of view on something to challenge yourself, to help yourself make sure that you're thinking about things critically, okay? So I was actually kind of afraid to read this book because what I had heard about it was Dambisa Moyo. She says, the subtitle is, so it's called Dead Aid, and the subtitle is Why Aid is Not Working and How There is a Better Way for Africa. So about a month ago or whatever, we had a talk about wonderful things that NGOs are doing in Africa. And so I thought, wow, it would be a real bummer to now read this book if it's like, oh, guess what? It's actually making things worse. It's like, it is more subtle than that. And so, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it today and hopefully have a chance to have some discussion about it. So Dambisa Moyo got her PhD in economics from Oxford University, and she has a master's from Harvard and her undergraduate degree from American University in Washington, D.C. All of the people who we look at, Esther Duflo, who is a professor at MIT, Jeffrey Sachs, they're all, people with like the credentials that say maybe they know something about this stuff and we should listen to them. Okay, so the first thing to be really clear about Dambisa Moyo is that she is not opposed to certain kinds of aid. So she's not opposed to emergency aid when there is like a natural disaster. And she also is not opposed to like charities, things that, like what we had talked about with Esther Duflo, charity to treat malaria, for example. But really what her argument is that helping some individuals here and there really won't make a difference to the growth of Africa, and that Africa needs to be sort of lifted out of poverty as what she sees as an extremely important thing. And we're going to talk about why. It's not just that making money is important for her, but we're going to talk about why she thinks it is so important that Africans get lifted out of poverty. So she says $100 billion worth of aid goes to Africa every year from other countries. $100 billion. But over the last 60 years, I'm sorry. She says over the last 60 years, growth and incomes for Africans has worsened. In the 1970s, 10% of Africans lived on $30 a month, and today that number is 70%. So what she thinks that most non-Africans don't understand is that about 60% of all Africans are under the age of 24. And in some countries, as much as 50% are under 15. So people in Africa are very young. And what her main concern is that these people are growing up. And if there are no jobs, which there are no jobs for them, that they could eventually there'll be more terrorism, just people are very desperate. And she points out, for example, that anyone born in 1997 or later in Somalia has never spent a day in school. Okay, that would be very common. And so we have extreme poverty, lack of education, and a situation rife for people to end up joining in terrorist organizations. And she also says that there's a lot of corruption, and we'll get into that later on into the talk, but that you can't decouple aid and corruption. And when there's that much money coming in, there's just a lot of corruption. And in fact, often the aid is given to countries that have dictators. There are 11 dictatorships in Africa, and so often this aid is actually helping to prop up these dictators. Now, she quotes George Bush, basically, beware of people having low expectations for you. And he said that in a speech to the NAACP, but she feels that basically the world has low expectations for Africa, and that the aid model is built on pity and belief that Africa cannot achieve growth. So, and she also says the people who are benefiting most are the African elite and not the average person. So aid is a band-aid and it doesn't provide a model for growth. And even if you support children who are dying, which sounds like a good idea, when they live, they won't be able to find jobs, and so we'll still have a big problem. Then I watched a video where Bill Gates basically said that he thought that her book was evil, and he used the word evil because he said it was resulting in people now not giving to charities. And he's like 50% less children are dying every year after this 30 years of intervention that we've been doing. And so to say, well, the children will live, but they won't have a job when they grow up, his perspective is, well, let's step one, get the children to live. Okay, so she points out that in the last 30 years, while all of this has been happening in Africa, 300 million Chinese moved out of poverty. And India actually has the largest middle class of the world, and they did not achieve that through these massive amounts of aid. There are more poor people in India, and there are more poor people in China, and yet when we think of India, we think of China, we think of them as developing nations, and we think of Africa as being so backwards. Well, that's what she says. I actually did work with a company that they were people who were consultants at Microsoft, and they returned back home. They were Nigerian nationals, and so I'm aware of the fact that there are highly educated and entrepreneurial people, of course, in Nigeria. But what she's saying is that the America and even the world's sort of perspective or perception is that she says, that what we think of Africa as poverty, war, corruption, and disease. Poverty, war, corruption, and disease does not attract investment. And we don't feel sorry for India or China, but why do we feel sorry for Africa? Okay, so here's why she says aid doesn't work. She says number one is corruption. We have lots of examples of African leaders siphoning off money and socking it away in Swiss bank accounts. And that, there are people, though, she says most of her critics are people who are in the aid community. And for example, a guy whose name is Jeffrey Sachs says, for just a modest $2.5 billion a year, we have reduced death through malaria by 40%, just with drugs, bed nets, and testing. And that before we can even talk about economic development, we need to discover, is disease burden one of the things that makes doing business there impossible? And then if it is, which it is, that's a good place to start. And so what he's saying sounds very reasonable to me also. So there's a guy named William Easterly, and he fights a lot with Jeff Sachs about aid in Africa. And basically Easterly's big thing is that we're supporting dictatorships. So what Jeff Sachs says, which I thought was interesting, is he's like, why are we having such slow growth in Africa? Well, here are some things. First of all, technology is diffusing through Africa. This is a positive thing. Where there were only 10 million cell phones in 1990, now there are 6 billion mobile phones. And that makes doing different kinds of business easier. And he says places that are closest to ports do well, but that the countries that are inland, people don't want to do business there. It's just harder, unless you have oil. And that there are places which are high in disease because of the rain and because of the temperature, and especially places where they have trouble growing food, which only recently in the last 20 years or 30 years, or since 1950, we've had better and better ways to grow food in bad climates. And also, a lot of those places don't have any infrastructure. So, and they don't have good education systems. Remember what we just said about Somalia. So he says we need to have clinical differential diagnoses and look at each specific country. And anyway, you can't really talk about like Africa as a continent because there's so many different countries there that you don't want to overgeneralize. Okay, now Dambisa Moyo also says that flooding small economies with foreign aid causes inflation. And as I understand it, it works like this. So let's assume that a country's currency is fixed and extra foreign currency enters the country, gets converted to a local currency, and then is spent on goods that can't be traded. So things like construction and services and so on. So the foreign currency gets changed into local currency and the money supply rises. When this happens, extra domestic demand pushes up domestic prices. When the prices go up, now you have trouble exporting because you lose competitiveness. So people lose their job, they become even more poor, and they need even more aid. And so instead of it being a positive thing, it's a negative thing. The next thing she says is that in Africa, there's not a culture of entrepreneurship. And she points to the fact that because the governments are propped up and kind of supported by aid and not through taxes, they don't have the same kind of incentive to stimulate entrepreneurship. In America, you can get a business license in 1 hour. In Africa, most African countries, it takes 2 years. So again, I alluded to that being a project manager on a project where we were building an intranet for a company in the banking sector. And there are issues happening in Africa. So people don't have birth certificates. A lot of people don't have birth certificates. They don't necessarily have street addresses the way that we do. And so it's difficult to know who people are to even allow them to get bank accounts, let alone to allow them to get credit. But Moya is saying she wants to hear African leaders talking about entrepreneurship and as we do in America. And she wants African leaders to put forth plans to get the economy moving. Now, she points out in other countries, especially like in America, that no one wants to hear from the leaders of African countries. So she's really offended by sort of this celebrity, Bono gives a concert to raise money for Africa, and she says, African presidents aren't even there on the stage talking about Africa and taking African leadership, right? We don't recognize like African authority. There's some kind of imperialism that comes along with this aid. We're giving you this money and we assume, and then we're going to treat you sort of like children, really, and not expect that you have anything to say about your own country. Now, the huge amount of money coming in means that there's more civil wars, there are coups d'etats, and dictatorship. And even dictators get huge amounts of aid, which props up their power. So Mugabe, who is in Zimbabwe, had received $300 million by 2006. And he's, his rule is characterized by all kinds of human rights violations. Okay, so what can we do? So she said we know what works. We've seen countries like China, India, Brazil, other models of development. And she says that increasing trade, microfinance, allowing people to have savings accounts, and actually taxing people, having the government provide goods and services, and then be held accountable for what they do with the money, and also having transparency around all of that. All of that is what she thinks should be the answers. She says that they can sell agricultural stuff to China. China has 1.3 billion people, but only 7% arable land. So she sees that as a market for African goods. Okay, this took me off to study a little bit about China. China had this, huge growth and all of that. And basically, China has been liberalizing and reforming, right? I kind of will skip some of this just in the interest of time. They started opening their domestic economy just when they joined the WTO. And with foreign investment, they also got a lot of foreign know-how into their system. Then I got into this whole thing about China holding 25% of the US debt, and that we owe the Chinese about $1.3 trillion. We pay tens of billions of dollars of interest every year on that, and then there was all kinds of disagreement over whether or not that was a good thing, with some people saying it's terrible and we're in debt to China and it's dangerous, and other people saying that in fact that pushes long-term interest rates lower, and that means that the interest rate that we as borrowers goes down and we can get mortgages. And so there's a whole thing there that you need to know something about macroeconomics to be able to sort out if it's which way you would believe on that, okay? And that and again, this idea of that China sells things to the United States, but then they keep their money actually in our banks, because if they took it and converted it to Chinese money and then put that money back into their own economy, that would raise the value of the Chinese money and make things in China more expensive. And that whole cycle of then the exports would be expensive, and we might not want to keep getting all their exports the way that we do. We wouldn't want to get imports from them. So but the bottom line is that she's like, look, our economy is so closely tied to the United States economy, and you guys have this kind of arrogance about, well, of course you would want to be tied to the United States because we're great. But she's pointing out that maybe our economy might not be as solid as we think it is, right? And this, especially going back to the recession that we had and all of that. Okay, in the end, what is sort of the purpose of all this? Okay, the purpose of all of this is just to show, first of all, she's not necessarily saying that the kind of aid that Esther Duflo was talking about is bad. So she's like, give money for charity, give money for education, give money to fight malaria, give money for prenatal nutrition. Great, but we've got to get the economy of Africa stimulated, because we've got to get Africa, we've got to raise the standard of living for all Africans as a point. Otherwise, what's going to happen when all these young people get a little older and there's no jobs? And so the gist of this is that I hope that I have modeled what I want to model as, what is it that as a church we believe. So what we believe in is the importance of critical thinking, and I'm trying to demonstrate that rather than taking things on faith. That's a lot more work to try to think critically about things. But over time, we will continue having this conversation about helping fight global poverty as part of commitment number 2, trying to be excellent to other conscious beings. I will end the way I always do. Atheists believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways.